Let me get there. Well, let's see here. Very happy to connect us, and thank you very much.
This is
Dr.
my pleasure.
Hans Koechler, with different affiliations there in Vienna with the University of Innsbruck. I believe you're still connected there.
Yes,
And also importantly, with the International Progress Organization. So we have been together at least 3 conferences by my count, and most recently again at an international conference, same sponsorship. And so it's always been very insightful and also to a degree provocative, your remarks at these conferences, which have drawn important focus to international organizations and relations between countries. Well, your work, the topic I think I wanted to talk with you about today was about the United Nations, on which you've spent a lot on that subject. And what I think your work in that area goes all the way back to at least 1990. Is that correct? Direct involvement exploring the subject?
it started even earlier in the 1980s.
Ah, right.
I did a conference in New York in 85 to celebrate at that time the 40th anniversary of the United Nations. And the topic was democracy in international relations. So the democratic reform of the UN was on the agenda at that time. And I do remember at that New York meeting, we also had an undersecretary of the United Nations attending and discussing with us.
Right. And then, of course, you had, I think, a second conference that you organized. Was that in 1990 or 91?
Yes, that was in 91 at the United Nations in Vienna. It was called Second Conference, not in relation to this other conference in New York, which I just mentioned, but it was the second conference on a more democratic United Nations. That was the title. The first conference on a more democratic United Nations, which we abbreviated as CAMDUN, CAMDUN 1, took place in New York in 1990. And so I did organize the follow-up conference, CAMDUN 2, in Vienna at the UN premises.
I see the distinction. Well, the first one in New York, was that held, although in New York City, presumably in Manhattan?
Yes.
Was that on the premises of the United Nations itself?
No, that was not on the premises. Only that one in Vienna, which I organized, was on the premises.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, and I wanted to get to that. Well, I'm a former New Yorker, and the UN was always prominent for people in New York who had an interest in international affairs.
Yes.
Because there'd be comings and goings in Midtown Manhattan. In fact, one of my closest neighbor of my parents at the time, was actually an employee of the United Nations, a full-time administrative employee. And if I had been a little bit more of a curious youth, I would have gone to him for a conversation, say, what do you do there at the United Nations? So I have no idea what he did, but again, I guess I say it as a presence.
Yeah.
And then, of course, out here, I live just north of San Francisco, and did live in San Francisco a number of years.
Yes.
A while ago. And as I mentioned, on the date of the ratification, which I think was June 25th, 1945. And then
Yes.
on the 26th was the signings. Um, those 75 years later, I went back into the former city of my residence, San Francisco, and visited the Opera House and the Plaza area adjacent to City Hall to just commemorate
Yeah.
the founding of the United Nations. And the other thing that's intriguing, which I'm sure you appreciate, in any of these treaties or legislation, it's always important to have the effective date. And apparently, as you probably know better than me, after they ratified it and then documents were signed by individual countries, they then had to be approved
Yes.
by the legislatures of those countries. And there
Yes.
were 50 signers, and they had to have everybody approve. And that
Mhm.
wasn't accomplished, I think, until October of 1945.
Indeed, yes, as it is always with international treaties.
Right, you've got to have
But
the
it was
approval.
fast anyway. Sometimes it takes many years until a treaty is ratified by all and enters
Right.
into force.
Well, certainly from that date of 1945, a long time ago, 75 years ago, um, there have been changes, many, many changes to the UN, which I'm sure you have tracked. And two of the more significant were the increase in the number of members of the United Nations. So
Yes.
I'll put you on the spot. How many members are there today in the United Nations?
Yeah, almost 200. I mean, it changes every year. I mean, it gets larger every year, the number.
Right. Yeah. Well, then, are there any observer states? For example, is the Palestinian state an observer or a member?
The Palestinian state is an observer only, and the reason is simple. The General Assembly decides about admission of a state as a member, but this decision is made upon a recommendation from the Security Council.
Uh-huh.
And that in the General Assembly, there would have been a large majority for full membership of Palestine, but the Security Council recommendation did not materialize and will not materialize in the foreseeable future because of the veto, as you will understand, of
Was that a veto of the United States?
Essentially the United States, yes. The United States would not agree to such an admission. And that's why the state has observer status. In other organizations that are affiliated with the United Nations, such as UNESCO in Paris, that problem does not exist because there is not this filter of a veto of certain member states. So at UNESCO, in UNESCO and many other intergovernmental organizations, Palestine is a full member.
Uh-huh. Right. Are there any other observer states that are worthy of note?
Yeah, certainly the Holy See, the Vatican.
Ah. And is that probably the only other one?
Yeah, and that is the only other one, as to my knowledge, and the Vatican is not would not have the aspiration to be a full and regular member, understandably, because
right.
It has the Holy See has a totally different agenda.
Well, it's certainly an important distinction for the Holy See as a religion to have that status.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, also, just I wanted to get some organizational matters taken care of, and that was the Security Council itself, which you've mentioned. It has the 5 permanent members, and of course, the world has changed since 1945 in terms of who might be considered to be in that five. But also there's been a switch with the actual governments represented, which was highly
Yes.
significant as to China.
True, yes, because originally the seat of China was occupied by the Republic of China, which is Taiwan, and only after the rapprochement between China and the United States, that is at the beginning of the 1970s, when President Nixon decided to enter to open diplomatic relations with China. Only from that time onwards was
Right. So let's see. You look a little. Oh, there we go. We're back.
the seats, so
Yeah.
to speak, switched.
Right. So also the other members. There are what 10 other members on. I wanted to clarify that 10 other rotating members, if you will. The other members of the Security Council. I think we've got it.
Those
Yeah,
rotate within 2 years. And interestingly, is the connection still okay now?
It is now okay.
Again,
Yes.
okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The important fact is that for the regional membership, there is this principle of
Yeah, we're having a little difficulty with our connection here.
So always you have. Is it okay now? Otherwise,
yes, it is okay now. Yeah, go ahead.
Otherwise, if it continues, I could try to switch to another one. What is the cause of the problem?
All right. I think the network bandwidth is low. Not sure. Maybe there's a lot of traffic going on with the UN agencies in Vienna.
Oh yeah, between the continents. Otherwise, I could try.
I think you're okay now. It's good. Very good. Let's see. There you go.
So,
yeah, we do have a problem. Let's see. Yeah, we do have a bandwidth
let
problem.
me just disconnect and reconnect.
Yeah, I think you are okay there. Go ahead. You're gonna come back, leave, and then come back. Yeah, why don't you come back on the link? Yeah, why don't you leave the meeting and then return? All right.
Now I'm back again on another network. So
oh, you are. There you go. Perfect. Yeah. Good. So we were talking about the Security Council, and
yes,
the non-5. Well, there are 10 other members.
Yes. I mean, there are 10 non-permanent members and 5 permanent members.
Right. Right.
And along, as I said before, if I may just continue that line, geographical balance exists among the 10 non-permanent members. All the regions are represented in that category. but geographical balance does not exist among the 5 permanent members, which, I mean, as the term says, that list of the 5 permanent members never changes, and it reflects the power constellation that existed when the organization was founded in 1945. That means important regions such as, for instance, Africa or Latin America, or also South Asia, Southeast Asia, are left out of the power balance, so to speak, in the councils. So the point I would make here is that the structure of the council in terms of permanent membership reflects or mirrors the power balance of a time where the situation was totally different. Now, 75 years later, the multipolar constellation is not the same as it was in 45.
Mhm. Or even in the 1990s, when you were advocating for democratization. So a shift even then in terms of, for example, India.
Yes.
So
yeah, but India is as India is still not in a position to really play its role in the United Nations because of not being a permanent member. The same, by the way, one could say about Japan, which is a major player in the global economy, in global affairs, but which has no say or no position as permanent member, while Europe is overrepresented as a region with 2 seats, the United Kingdom and France. And both of these countries are not anymore global powers in the way they were in 45. In 45, they were certainly among those major countries that were able to give the necessary authority to decisions of the United Nations, because that, in my understanding, would be the idea of a council with permanent members that have special privileges and special responsibility, because the council cannot take any decision without the consent of those 5 permanent members. Mm-hmm. So at that time, those were the countries in 45 that were able to provide the necessary strength and authority to the council. Now the situation is different. Now one would need other major countries as permanent members.
Well, have there been moves, motions made, if you will, in the General Assembly or anywhere to alter the composition of the Security Council? Has this been something that has come up from time to time?
Yeah, it has come up repeatedly, in fact, since the 1980s. And it started with more concrete efforts at the beginning of the 1990s, namely after the end of the East-West conflict, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and a new constellation emerged in global affairs. Many people thought it would now be the time to take necessary measures to adapt the world organization to the new constellation. So the several secretaries general of the United Nations and also presidents of the General Assembly did set up expert committees for reform of the United Nations and for reform of the Security Council. And many detailed proposals have been worked out, and all this has been discussed in the General Assembly, but it led it has led to nowhere, and it will lead to nowhere for one particular reason. Any change to the charter, that means also to the Security Council, to the list of permanent members, so to speak, or number of permanent members, requires the consent of the existing permanent members.
Ah,
And that's why nothing has happened. There would be a large majority in the General Assembly, but the General Assembly can only make amendments to the Charter with 2/3 majority, by the way, but it can only do so if the Security Council approves. And
well,
so
that's a key point. It would require that charter that was approved in San Francisco,
yeah,
you say, procedurally would have to be amended, changing
yeah,
the structure, but the Security Council has the veto power.
yeah. So it's a vicious circle, so to speak. And no procedure can be changed, not even a comma can be changed in the Charter unless the 5 permanent members agree. And understandably, countries that are not really great powers anymore would not agree to losing, for instance, a privileged position, should one have considered, for instance, to abolish the veto and to replace it by a qualified majority requirement. That is what some people also suggested, instead of the veto, to introduce a qualified majority, so-called super majority of, let's say, 3/4 of the votes in matters of international peace and security. But the existing permanent members would not agree to that. And by the way, the issue of the veto and the resulting impossibility to reform the organization in future was widely and openly discussed in San Francisco. And interestingly, it was delegates from Latin American countries, for instance, from Mexico, who were very outspoken. And the Mexican delegate, for instance, said in one of those discussions in San Francisco before the adoption of the Charter, he said that to him it appears that the veto, or establishing the veto in the Charter, is creating a situation in which a mouse can be condemned, but the elephant can roam free, because that is the reality. The superpowers, those powers who have the veto right, can never be held to account by the Council because they can veto the resolution. So one can only condemn minor offenders if the 5 permanent members agree, but the permanent members themselves cannot be held to account. And this point was also made clear in from the other side, so to speak. Cordell Hull, who was one of the main drafters of the United Nations Charter, stated very clearly and openly that there should be no illusion that the Security Council is a law unto itself. That means that the Security Council represents special power given to it by the permanent members, and that would not be something that could be negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the former Secretary of State of the United Nations in the post-war years also stated that the United States would not remain a day in this organization without the veto.
Right.
So it would not be worth it.
Wow.
That was Foreign Minister Dulles.
Oh, yes. Well, this is no question a flaw in the organizational integrity, and has an impact for its ability to carry out effectively its mission. And these days, in any kind of domain, the corporate domain or governance anywhere, the whole issue is the rights of governance and what is proper governance, and entitling and enabling the participants and the constituencies a right to governance. And if you have a flawed governance structure, it has its implications, as you suggest.
Yeah, and that, as far as the United Nations is concerned, that is now a problem of legitimacy of the organization as a guarantor of peace and of the international rule of law, because it's somehow demoralizing if the Security Council takes action when member states violate the law or use force against other states, while when permanent members take such action, no resolution of the Security Council is forthcoming. Never in the history of the United Nations since 1945 has it happened that a permanent member was held to account for an illegal use of force. And there was more than one illegal uses of force by permanent members. And it's definitely not just by the United States, by the Soviet Union, by China. I mean, but nothing ever happened. And so, as in the individual life, if people realize that certain people are always just above the others and are immune, so to speak, from enforcement of the norms, the people will take the norms not seriously. That's the case in any state.
Right.
And it undermines the rule of law. So this is the one of the basic issues of the legitimacy or also relevance of the United Nations organization.
Yeah, right.
In our time.
Well, certainly the permanent members, as you call it, and I think it's a very good description, the constellation, of powers, where you have just say the UK, India is about to surpass the GDP of the UK.
Yes.
Just about to do that, and of course already exceeds that of France. And then you have Russia way down the list of economic powers, 8, 9, 10, or lower in the economic rankings.
Yes. Yeah, there is a huge imbalance in regards to the economic power of member states.
Right.
Not,
well, one of the issues,
yes,
it always seemed the United States, often an issue that came up was the fact that we were paying much higher dues than other countries.
Yes.
A high proportion.
Yeah.
Although we may have been delinquent in recent years. What's the standing of the U.S. on its payable?
Yes. Yeah. Of course, there are very precise mechanisms to determine the share of each member state in the budget of the United Nations organization. There are several criteria of weighting the annual contribution. And one of the important criteria, understandably, is the economic strength of the state, but also the number of population and so on. So it's a complex system of criteria on which the member states have agreed. And my position is any state, just as long as the criteria are properly applied by the United Nations administration, any state just should pay that amount. Otherwise, one will have to initiate a renegotiation of the criteria, and maybe one would have to weigh economic strength a little, would have to give economic strength a little less importance. I think this would be the main factor to reduce the United States annual contribution.
Right. Yeah, that's.
But the other problem is, as far as I have seen or I have followed the debate on contributions in the United States or also within the United States administration, the other problem seems to me is that if one is a member in an organization, one should not make the payment of the fee depending upon specific decisions of the organization. The payment, I mean, to the general budget. Payment to specific projects, this is anyway voluntary. And the United States or other big countries, they may decide, for instance, not to take part in certain projects of the United Nations and would not pay to certain specialized activities. But the contributions to the general budget, they should not be made dependent on whether the majority of the General Assembly passes a certain resolution or not. I mean, that is just democracy to accept that. And anyway, the major payers, as the United States have always, can always block any important decision in the Security Council.
Right.
Because the important decisions are only made by the Security Council. This is also, by the way, often overlooked. The General Assembly is not a world parliament. It is not a legislative body. And the General Assembly, according to the Charter, can only make recommendations. So the resolutions in practically almost all matters of substance, the resolutions of the General Assembly have the nature of recommendations. They are not binding in a legal sense. Only Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7 of the Charter are legally binding on all member states.
Right. Right. Very good point.
And
Yeah.
also another aspect of this internal power balance of the United Nations is that the General Assembly cannot deal with issues if they are being dealt with by the Security Council. So whenever the Security Council takes up a certain issue, it cannot be handled by the General Assembly in any way. And that's why there is this annual ritual that the Security Council, through the Secretary General, of course, submits every year a list of topics that are on the agenda of the Council, so that there is no conflict with the General Assembly.
Right.
But
right. Well, that's very
anyway,
interesting.
the Assembly is not a legislative institution, and it's not a world parliament. And for that reason, by the way, there has also been an initiative or a kind of movement now since maybe 20 years already for what is called a second parliamentary assembly, or kind of parliamentary assembly or consultative assembly of the United Nations. And the idea is, in the General Assembly, there are only, all delegates are representatives of the states, of the executive power of each state. They are not parliamentarians. The idea would be that there should also be elected parliamentarians from all the global regions who would somehow advise the advise the United Nations. And that's what is called this initiative of a parliamentary assembly for the United Nations.
So would this be similar to the European Parliament, in effect?
In a sense, it would be similar, because the representatives would be elected by the people in the respective countries or regions, as it is in Europe. It would be different in one other respect. The European Parliament, in a basic respect, is in fact a legislative assembly.
Right.
It is not completely sovereign as legislator because it has to act in tandem with the European Commission, but anyway, it has legislative capacity. A parliamentary assembly of the United Nations could not have this capacity under the present charter, because that would require charter reform. Under the present charter, the only possibility that exists is for the General Assembly to establish subsidiary organs. So the idea would be to have such a parliamentary assembly as a subsidiary consultative body, so to speak.
Well, that's quite interesting. It would seem to offer the opportunity for greater engagement by the
Yes,
citizens of these countries.
indeed, yes. And that was also a proposal that was made very strongly in both Camden conferences in New York and in Vienna, as I do remember. And it was also a point Harold Stassen, who was a member of the United States official delegation in San Francisco, a point that Harold Stassen quite firmly made. He spoke at our first international conference on a more democratic United Nations in New York. At the time, he was already in his 80s, but still very actively participating in the debates on the legacy of the United Nations and how to improve it. And he also did present a draft charter.
Oh, he did.
For amendments, an amended charter of the United Nations.
Well, that's quite significant. He having been at the original conference, he would carry a sense of legitimacy and perspective to those efforts.
Indeed, yes.
Well, in addition to the main body of the United Nations, if you want to call it General Assembly, and also, of course, the Security Council, there are also these other agencies and secretariats. I think, aren't there agencies in Vienna of the United Nations?
There are several. There is, for instance, UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and there is also the United Nations Office for Crime Control. Both of these fields of activities of the United Nations are being handled or organized from the Vienna office. And in addition to that, but not as affiliate organizations of the United Nations, there are also other international agencies with the same worldwide reach as the UN. And on top of it, of course, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is also located in the same area. In terms of infrastructure and buildings, it's somehow on the same campus as the United Nations office.
Well, that adds to the allure and legitimacy and standing of Vienna as a center of international activity.
Yeah. And there is another important institution that is also located in the United Nations premises, and that is the Preparatory Commission for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
Yes.
That the problem there is that this treaty is already has already been negotiated and signed by many states, so that there is a preparatory commission for it, which now is operating since 25 years. But the treaty is not yet in force because it requires the ratification of certain states. that have not yet done so, and that will not do so in the foreseeable future. But anyway, the Test Ban Treaty Organization, the Preparatory Commission, does very useful work because it has the most sophisticated seismic detection system globally. Because in order to monitor nuclear explosions, in order to enforce a treaty, should it ever come into force, one needs, of course, one needs the best, I would say, technical equipment to detect, and infrastructure globally to detect seismic occurrences that may give evidence of secret nuclear testing. So all of that is in place, and all of that is already working perfectly. And the irony is that is also an important aspect of international realpolitik, that some of the states who have not ratified the treaty so that it cannot enter into force are very actively cooperating with the Preparatory Commission in terms of the detection of seismic occurrences, because those states may be interested in the information that is gathered, so that they, as far as their own concerns, in terms of their own concerns about other states, would always be up to date every moment.
Well, that's
why they participate in it very actively and in the infrastructure, though not ratifying it.
Well, that's it. The benefits of membership. You get the information.
Yeah.
For those who are in it.
Yeah.
Now, just also speaking about Vienna, it's my recollection that doesn't OPEC usually meet in Vienna?
OPEC has the headquarters in Vienna also, yeah, that is another. I did not mention it because it is not in any way affiliated with the United Nations, and it is an organization devoted to a more specific and partly also regional issue. Yes, but it has its headquarters in Vienna since a long time.
Right. Well, very good. Well, so it would seem that these agencies, some of which you've mentioned, and others, do have benefits for their participants, not strictly in peacekeeping objectives or obligations, but nonetheless within the universe of the United Nations, these participants do have value. I mean, they experience value. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, you mean participants in the organization in general or in specialized organizations?
In the specialized agencies.
Oh, yeah, sure. For instance, for me, UNESCO is an important example. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization in Paris. It is, I would say, it covers a very important area of global affairs that is of direct relevance for also the United Nations organization, because understanding between cultures, between religions and civilizations is a major issue of global peace nowadays, even more so than, let's say, at the time when the United Nations was founded.
Well, it enables engagement between countries and understanding.
Yeah, and UNESCO has launched many important initiatives also in recent years in terms of the dialogue between cultures and civilizations. And I do recall when we did start our NGO, the International Progress Organization, that was in 1972. In that year, we established a contact with UNESCO, and I visited also the Division of Philosophy of UNESCO in Paris. And we undertook our first international conference on cultural dialogue between nations as a cooperation project with UNESCO.
Right.
In the meantime, of course, this issue of intercultural relations has also been taken up by the United Nations itself. The United Nations did set up a high-level working group on the dialogue of civilizations, and now is also operating what is called the Alliance of Civilizations.
Oh,
That is an initiative of the United Nations organization.
right. Well, that's very good and encouraging progress and further development of another area of dialogue.
Yeah.
And speaking of a couple of other agencies, one that really came to light in the US was the World Health Organization.
Yes,
And very,
in Geneva.
a lot of controversy there. And of course,
Yeah.
President-elect Biden has already committed to rejoin WHO.
Here, my position is that the World Health Organization is structured in such a way that it was not able to act efficiently and responsible when this huge global crisis started at the beginning of this year, 2020. And we have seen there the problem of politicization, what I call politicization of specialized agencies. Specialized agencies, whether it's UNESCO in the field of culture or WHO in the field of health, or also the World Labor Organization in the field of labor and social affairs, should operate independently of politics. And the office holders of these organizations should not be appointed on the basis of a bargaining along the lines of power politics. But that's what often happens, so that people who do not have the qualifications for the specialized area will be appointed to lead the organizations, or will be appointed to leading offices, leading responsibilities in the organization. That's a problem with the World Health Organization. And I personally fully understand the position of the president of the incumbent president in office of the United States vis-a-vis the WHO, because the information we were given, the world was given at the beginning of the corona crisis, was inaccurate. It came and the alert came much, much too late. And if the organization, if the WHO would have acted as it is supposed to act as a professional organization, it would have acted independently of a major member state and one of the most powerful countries in the world. It would have acted independently. It would not have acted on the basis of false information, and it would not have told the world that there is no infection, human to human, for instance, and it would have classified this situation as a global health emergency very early on. That came much too late. The organization also expressed a position according to which there should be no travel bans, because that would be unfair and discriminatory and so on. I have followed all of this because I did watch all the media briefings by the Director General in those days, in January and February. And for that reason, my position is that such specialized organization, the procedures for the appointment of the personnel and the leading functionaries should be changed So that, for instance, for the WHO, it should be a requirement that a specialist in medical health, let's say a doctor of medicine, only such a specialist who has the professional knowledge and capacity will be appointed as head of the organization, but not a politician who has many other things in his mind and on his agenda, because that was the situation in the WHO at the beginning of the year.
What is of the incumbent? Does he have a term, an ending term coming up that reformers could look to make a change there? Is he in for how much longer, to your knowledge?
That I have not. I'm not aware when his term will expire.
Right.
But maybe when the term is up for when the term expires, it well might be that the member states will choose somebody else or someone who has impeccable professional credentials.
Professional qualifications.
This
yes.
is my qualifications. This is my position for an organization such as WHO, because in terms of health, one cannot take things easy.
Right.
And one cannot act politically or in a way just to please certain powerful member states.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be interesting to see with the U.S. apparently rejoining the WHO, as the president-elect has announced on day one, or maybe January 21, what commentary there is around that. Whether, okay, we're back in, but we're going to be working for the following changes and reforms. One would hope that it would, we'll hear that or read that it simply won't be a rejoining, that there'll be some kind of important message conveyed. But who knows?
Yeah, to
I
me,
think there was.
It seems political. It seems to be rather polemical to make such a move on the very first day in office. It is a kind of polemical vis-a-vis the previous president, and I do not know whether this will be perceived well internationally.
Right, whether simply rejoining, that could still be subject to criticism, that it's just superficial. But it probably reflects the other parties, that is the Democrats and the Biden, and also some establishment people, that the U.S. was seen as stepping back from international engagements. So the first thing we want to do is to re-engage, to be there. Now, the important thing is to make changes. But
and sometimes one can only changes can only be achieved if one keeps away for a while in order to make sure that reforms are undertaken.
Right. Well, certainly you've enlightened me tremendously, which is what I was expecting, on the governance issues, if I can put them that way, that exist within the United Nations on different levels, which can be summed up as you have, as democratization of the UN. And that would certainly call forth the involvement of a lot of different people. I mean, there's a United Nations Foundation, I believe, in the US. I don't know, one of my former colleagues was the executive director of that for a short period of time. I didn't even know that existed. But apparently there's also such an organization in Russia where various people participate in a so-called or apparent civilian support of the United Nations. Maybe you're aware of that.
Yeah, and there are United Nations associations in many countries all around the globe to support the organization.
Well, they need to raise their profiles, I think, although, some of these topics are beyond general interest. Um, well, anyway, let me ask you this. What's next for the International Progress Organization? What is your immediate agenda or next steps coming up?
Our next step is a project and an international consultation on responsibility in international affairs. That is the theme of our discussions in this year. And unfortunately, because of the coronavirus pandemic, this is being delayed. We were supposed to have such a consultation on responsibility in international affairs with experts, professors, also journalists from all around the globe, including the United States and Russia and India, just to name a few countries. We were supposed to have that meeting in the middle of last month in the Imperial Hotel in Vienna. Now we don't know when we will be able to hold that meeting. The other activity, the other project we are working on now, and we hope that after, when the pandemic is over, we can convene a meeting on that issue too, is about the law of the sea. This is a problem that is often overlooked. The law of the sea and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has triggered a kind of run on the resources, on the maritime resources all around the globe. And there are many maritime disputes now, particularly in the South China Sea.
Yes.
Also in the Eastern Mediterranean, that have implications far beyond those regions, and that have implications also for global peace and stability. So we are working out now a project on the problems of the law of the sea and the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. And we will study that in particular in regard to the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the plan is, if the coronavirus pandemic allows us, so to speak, to have a meeting by the middle of next year or in fall of next year on one of the islands of the Mediterranean.
Well, that would be a very attractive venue, I would think.
Yeah, we are thinking of Malta, which has a kind, which is also directly concerned in such matters as far as its maritime zones are concerned, and a country that has also a certain neutral status concerning the major conflicts going on.
Well, that would be quite relevant to the current situation, because there are these bodies of water, seas,
yes,
where there are new, if you want to say, participants, so to speak, that are asserting their rights to this.
Yes, and the problem is that quite often in areas such as the South China Sea or the Mediterranean Sea, which is a semi-enclosed sea, the claims of jurisdiction of continental shelf and exclusive economic zones are conflicting. These jurisdictional areas are overlapping, and that leads often to serious conflicts and tensions, as we see now between Greece and Turkey, and also among other Mediterranean countries in the Eastern Mediterranean. So that needs very cautious steps of negotiations and arbitration in certain cases.
Will be a very highly relevant convening, and I certainly hope that that can be held by the middle of next year or the fall. And of course, that's an uncertain period of time, and you need planning in advance. for
Yeah.
that, but I think it's quite relevant. And one other area occurs to me, which is the Arctic and
Yes.
the melting of the ice up there.
Sure.
And I was speaking with someone recently about threats to Russia.
Yes.
And certainly, if the ice melts up there in the Arctic, there can be naval activity
Yes.
uh, going along that coast more
Yes.
readily.
Yeah. And also as far as the conditions in the on the other side, so to speak, towards the American continent are
Oh, yes,
concerned,
right.
whether the straits may
Of
be
course.
open in future because of the melting ice.
Right. Yeah. So that whole
That would
Arctic
open up
issue
a new,
will be another
yes,
one. Yeah.
yes.
Well, you've got a lot of topics and subjects that can continue to occupy your interest and
Yeah,
scholarship.
yeah,
And it's so good that you're involved with this, and especially as the president of the International Progress Organization, that you can organize and direct these initiatives.
yeah. We try to continue now. It is almost 50 years that the organization has existed,
Right.
and the conditions under which we work are really have changed drastically. If I compare the situation now to that during the Cold War, the international environment is now totally different. But it's
Mhm.
a challenge to be accepted or to be taken.
Right. Well, fortunately, we have, there's someone of your experience and perspective over this whole period of time, which can be aware of the historical significance of present day developments and therefore also a projection of the danger of where things can go.
Yeah. And we see our role also in this, in a kind of consultative
Mm,
mission, because we are, as an NGO, as a non-governmental organization, we have been an organization in consultative status with the United Nations, namely with ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council,
mm,
and also with the UNDPI, United Nations
right.
Department of Public Information.
Mm,
And although now all these activities are quite reduced because of the present situation,
right.
I mean, we
Yeah.
will continue to participate in meetings
Right.
as soon as that is again possible
Right.
in United Nations meetings and make our statements or present our proposals as we have done now.
Well, I think this technology that we're using this morning, um, does offer, I think, more frequent meetings, more
Yes,
frequent convenings of people who normally would have to travel great distances and
that is also true.
inconvenience of that. So
Yeah,
that's
that
good.
is true.
But it also, nonetheless, the in-person
Yeah,
acquaintances that are made have great validity to them.
yeah, nothing can replace in-person meetings, and that's also true, I would say, from my experience with the UN, or it will be true also at the highest levels of power. Uh, for instance, if you take the Security Council, the delegates sitting in of the member
Mm,
states sitting in one chamber negotiating or discussing a major global crisis. This is a different situation from each of them sitting in his office in front of the computer. In
that's right.
terms of
Yeah. I mean, you get up
dynamic of
from the
negotiation,
in-person session and go off and have coffee together or lunch
yeah,
or other informal meetings, which establish a real important personal
yeah.
connection and see people in action. Um, and just in the case of the U.S., um, it will be interesting, as it always is, at the beginning of any new administration, who are the persons and their personalities that
Yes.
are appointed to these positions. And you can only see their personalities when you're in person. You know, someone reading a statement,
Yes.
that's fine. You can see the words, but
Yes.
as you know better, far better than me, at a in-person meeting, you can see whether they are a courteous individual or
Yes.
brusque or
Yeah.
not attentive to other
Yes.
people.
That's exactly so. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Hans, thank you very, very much for your time. And I can't wait for us to reconvene again, um, preferably in person, but before that, maybe again another conversation like
Yeah.
this. It's been
It was a pleasure for me too, Bill. And
thank you
I
very,
hope
very
to
much. And
continue that.
whenever I get pointed towards Vienna, I know who I'll call.
Yeah. You are most welcome to visit me right in the center of Vienna in the headquarters of our organization.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, bye-bye.